shark chomping on our screen. Our first reading comes from a book called World of Wonders by the poet and now essayist Amy Nezhukumatathil, who writes on a variety of things in the natural world by way of, number one, just making us feel the wonder of the natural world, and also reflecting on her childhood, her experiences of parents who had her outdoors a lot, and the experiences of being a child of immigrants growing up in this nation. It's a fascinating set of essays. The little excerpt that I'm reading comes from, it's also got delightful illustrations. This little excerpt comes from a chapter called Firefly, Photinus Piralis, and this is the part I'll share with you, comes from the end of this essay. She says, for a beetle, fireflies live long and full lives, around 2 years, though most of it is spent underground, gloriously eating and sleeping to their heart's content. When we see these beacons flashing their lights, they usually have only 1 or 2 weeks left to live. Learning this as a child, when I could often be found walking slowly around untrimmed lawns, stalling and not quite ready to go inside for dinner. And this is what drew me to this part. She's naming the experience of finding the holy or the sacred in her world. When I learning this as a child, when I could often be found walking slowly around untrimmed lawns, stalling and not quite ready to go inside for dinner, it made me melancholy, even in the face of their brilliance. I couldn't believe something so full of light would be gone so soon. I know I will be searching for fireflies all the rest of my days, even though they dwindle a little bit more each year. I can't help it. They blink on and off, a lime glow to the summer night air, as if to say, I am still here. You are still here. I am still here. You are still here. I am. You are. Over and over again. Perhaps I can will it to be true. Perhaps I can keep those summer nights with my family inside an empty jam jar with holes poked in the lid, a twig and a few strands of grass tucked inside. And for those unimaginable nights in the future, when I know I'll miss my mother the most, I will let that jar's sweet glow serve as a nightlight to cool and cut the air for me. Our assigned Bible reading this morning comes from the book of 1 Kings. This is the other Solomon story I mentioned last week that we get in our cycle of readings. We get it 3 times. It's from 1 Kings chapter 8. Then Solomon stood before this is after Solomon has finished having Israel's first temple built. And they brought the Ark of the Covenant in, and he's giving a long ornate prayer to dedicate the space. We get part of that prayer. When Solomon stood before the altar of God in the presence of the whole assembly of Israel and spread out his hands to heaven, he said, O God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below, keeping your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly to be faithful to you with all their hearts. You kept your promise to your servant David. By your deeds today, you fulfill what you said to him in words. Therefore, O God of Israel, keep your promise to your servant David when you said, you'll never lack for a person to sit before me on the throne of Israel, if only your successors are careful how they behave, walking before me as you yourself did. O God of Israel, may the promise you made to your servant David come true. But can God really dwell on earth? Heaven itself, the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? Hear the prayer and plea for mercy of your servant, O God. Hear the cry and the prayer that I make in your presence today. May your eyes watch over this temple day and night, and over this place where you said my name will be there. And foreigners as well, those who do not belong to your people Israel. If they come from a distant country for the sake of your name, for they will hear of your name, your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. If they come and pray towards this temple, then hear from heaven where your home is, and do whatever they ask of you, so that all the peoples of earth may know your name and revere you as your people Israel, and may know that this house bears your name. This is God's good news. What are places that feel sacred to you? This is a question that I posted on the Facebook friends and members list the other day. I'm wondering about those places where you feel something, call it holy, call it spirit, call it God, something that calls you beyond yourself, but maybe also in a way grounds you more firmly in your body, roots you to earth and to your community. I'll give just a second if anyone wants to come off mute and name a place or put a place in the chat, you're welcome to do that. Just thinking about places that are holy to us or sacred. Places there where we have felt something powerful.
I would say our home, where like all of our memories are made, and like it starts out as this house, and then as you invite more people that you love into it, it just becomes a sacred place we call home.
You. The sanctuary of your home. Thank you. And Priscilla put in the chat our church sanctuary. Karen put in the chat my yard and a beach. Christine said the sea. Thank you all for those. My cat finds my preaching to be enticing. Feel free to keep adding things in the chat if you like as we go on. Places are important. That's what the story is after. That's what I'm after this morning. They gather meaning. They hold significance. They tell us stories that connect us to the people who've come before us in those places. In a different religious tradition, if you were to walk into any mosque in the world during one of the prescribed times of prayer, you notice that every person in there has their body pointed in the same direction. If you're to walk in before people had gathered to pray, you could figure out the direction they're going to face by finding the mihrab. The mihrab is most often a decorated niche in a mosque wall. It's what indicates the direction that people pray. When Muslims pray, wherever they are, they orient their bodies towards Mecca, a sacred place for them. More specifically, they orient their bodies toward the Kaaba, which is that large cubic building in the city that Islamic tradition says was built by Abraham and his son. It's the holiest shrine in Islam. So 5 times each day, Muslims who practice the daily prayers literally pray toward the temple, sacred space. Some 1,500 years before the birth of Islam, Solomon built Israel's first temple. Yes, as I mentioned last week, this story shows up 3 times in the 3-year cycle of Bible readings we draw from. It's that big a deal. And yes, it's still true that Solomon's story is tragedy and cautionary tale. He was a king full of promise, whose insatiable appetites brought suffering and division. It's also true that this temple looms large in Israel's story of itself as sacred space. It was the first time they had a centralized place dedicated to worship, a place where people could go to seek encounter with God alongside masses of other worshipers. Solomon's prayer of dedication here includes a request on behalf of outsiders. He imagines that people outside of Israel will hear about God and will come to, as he says, pray towards the temple. He asks God to honor their prayers. Because most of us are outsiders to Israel, the story then invites us to consider ourselves in that category too. If we're to keep on reading this prayer of dedication, we'd also see Solomon's prayer for the nation's army, in which he asks God to be with them if they pray towards the land before going into battle. And then he asks God to forgive the nation if they fall into error, but then repent and pray towards the land. All of it points towards places are important, the story means. And bodies in places are also important. But it also names a paradox. Building the temple was a massive project. It took a number of years, a lot of expense, a tremendous amount of labor. It gave the people a place to travel to, a place to gather, gave a home for the Ark of the Covenant, which had been the physical symbol of God's presence with the people before. Right in this long prayer of dedication for this new and important building, Solomon asks, are you really going to live here, God? Because even the highest heavens can't contain you, much less this puny building that I've made. It's a good point and a good question. How can God be associated with one particular place when God imbues every place? It's a little bit of a quandary. And those of us who come from Protestant traditions have complicated legacies with it. Some of our spiritual forebears were so concerned about people getting the creator and the creation mixed up that they stripped all of the decorations out of their churches altogether. They didn't want people to get confused into thinking that God could be reduced to a thing or a place. The irony is that God has sometimes been trapped only inside the Protestant mind, which I can attest is a notoriously tortured place. Several years ago, Kathy and I had the chance to visit Montreal, which is an old Catholic city, maybe more of a post-Catholic city now, not sure. In our wanderings about the city, we stopped at Montreal's version of the Notre Dame Cathedral. We walked inside the cavernous sanctuary with tourists and visitors buzzing all around. There was a lot of iconography and statuary that didn't really speak to me. The biblical characters looked far too European for anyone's good. But all of the architecture in that space is designed to draw the eyes upward, up beyond the statues to where there is an eerie and gorgeous blue light, and above that to the geometric designs in the ceiling. The effect is to make you feel small and expansive at the same time. People are instinctively hushed inside that space. It's a taste of the infinite inside a finite place. I sat on a pew and just took deep breaths. But it was also true that God was not confined by that space. It had its sacred effect, but it was not the only way to experience and not the only place in which we experienced sacredness. Also in our wanderings around the city, we happened upon interactive public art. One spot was a plaza with families and people milling all around and fountains shooting water out of the ground. There was a stand that anyone could walk up to that seemed kind of like a pulpit. So how could I resist it? I got in line. When you get up there, there was a conductor's wand attached to it. You pick up the wand and some music would start and the fountains would gush in response to the conductor. At another spot, we found a long bank of covered swing sets, 3 swing sets per stand. There were, I don't know, maybe a half a dozen or more. Each swing was like its own music box, so that when someone sat on it and started to swing, there was a set of haunting and beautiful tones that would play, unique to each particular swing. So people made music together simply by moving back and forward in space. Those spots too, in addition to the cathedral, the plaza and the swing sets, they were holy and sacred. It's like entering into creativity that was meant to surprise and to delight, to turn whoever happened to be there in any given moment into a temporary congregation that embodied a spirit of playfulness and joy. It was like church outside of church. We traipsed the street of a foreign city and stumbled into the Holy of Holies. Places matter. Our bodies matter. Our particular bodies in particular places at particular times are how we experience the presence of that which is greater than our bodies and greater than those spaces. And over the past year and a half, we've all had our sense of place and our practices around place challenged. For those of us who are local, we've been unable to gather inside the sweltering humidity of our sanctuary and enjoy looking at other sweaty, fully embodied people while feeling the discomfort of wooden pews under our backsides. Some of us miss that dearly. I know that some people who worship with us from afar have seen beloved spiritual community disband. There is real and deep grief that is a part of all of this. There is legitimate anger as we see people continue to spread misinformation and resist vaccination and masking while a new variant once again fills our hospitals to capacity. It's an interesting and a strange time to read about the dedication of a building when gathering in a building is the thing we're not able to do. But maybe there's encouragement for us too, in the reminder that God is present in places, but not bound by those places. Maybe there's encouragement for us in this stories, in this text notion of praying towards. What do we orient our bodies and ourselves toward in order to encounter the sacred? We've created real virtual community here. Virtual is not the same as in person, but that difference does not make it less authentic. We see digital versions of each other, but this has still involved for us a weekly practice of placing our bodies in seats.
Snacks is coming.
Often the same seats each week, and looking at each other's faces, sometimes hearing each other's voices, lifting up the prayers that people share, holding each other's joy and grief and anger and exaltation within the room of our own hearts. We orient ourselves toward the sacred that arises in our midst, no matter how we are gathered. And the sacred is beyond the bounds of our gathering as well, in those places that you named out loud and in the chat, the places some of you put on Facebook, in the blooms coloring your gardens and the burst of flavor from a tomato right off the vine, in the smile of a child abandoned to joy or gnashing of sharp teeth, and the steady breath of a pet abandoned to sleep, in a moment of quiet stillness, and in chords and rhythm that move your hips to dance. Sacredness, I mean, is all around. And now, even now, maybe especially now is as good a time as any to point ourselves toward it, to give it our attention, to let it beckon to us, let it draw us out. This is God's good news. Amen.